Good afternoon, evening, morning. Hi, everybody. This is session 9, Deaf History. I really enjoy talking about this, but I do want to give a disclaimer that, as we all should know and be aware of, history is written by those that have the ability to do it, the ability to write it, the ability to have the sources and connections to share out their experiences. And in that same light, history for the deaf is still being uncovered today. So although this session is going to capture what the history is of this community, it certainly omits tons and tons and tons of things by virtue of timing, but also of things that have not yet been revealed. So I do want to give you the session. There's absolutely no way that one could explain history of the deaf in one session. I just want to give you a snapshot of it. So we start our session with Martha's Vineyard. If you haven't been to Martha's Vineyard, or if you don't know where Martha's Vineyard is, it is off the coast of Massachusetts, over here. So we're like down here somewhere. This is Martha's Vineyard. It's a beautiful place. I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures. And before 1817, so Martha's Vineyard was known in the deaf community, in the deaf world, it was known for a place, an island where everyone knew American, or everyone knew signed language. It was actually called Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. There was a hereditary deafness in that area where if your parents were deaf, maybe you were hearing, but maybe your siblings were deaf, or maybe one parent was hearing and one parent was deaf. So there was this sense of common language, because even if you were hearing, you still knew how to communicate with the deaf. That was very present among you. Everyone knew sign, and sign and speech had the same respect in terms of perspective. If you went in somewhere, or you were communicating with someone and you noticed that they were deaf, boom, people would just switch into signing. And I don't want to say American Sign Language. I do want to caution and say American Sign Language was not yet invented or created. So this was Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. And we call it now the Vineyard dialect. So this is important to know. Martha's Vineyard was the island where everyone knew the signed language, and there was a hereditary deafness present. So we speed up to 1817 in America. So they took a little boat, right, to America, where we find Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, this guy right here. He was a minister from Hartford, Connecticut, so that's where he lived. And his neighbor was Mason Fitch Cogswell. He was a physician. And Mason's daughter was Alice Cogswell, and Alice was deaf. This is Alice up here. Say hi. All right, so Alice had meningitis, spinal meningitis, and she became deaf. So if you didn't know, if you could get spinal meningitis, and that can lead to a level of deafness or profound deafness. So Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet knew Mason Fitch Cogswell and Alice Cogswell. At this time, just want to paint a picture for you, there were several options for the deaf. But as I talk about these, I want you to answer or think about how you would answer this question below. How do these options reflect the view people had of the deaf? So your first option was, if you had money, you hire a private tutor in hopes that someone could please teach and educate your poor deaf child. You also had the Braidwood Academy in Scotland. This, if you had the opportunity and the money to, you'd send your child off, knowing that Braidwood Academy, it was the only institution that had remote understanding of teaching deaf people. You would keep your child at home, which most of the time people did. Or you would send them to an asylum, like the asylum where individuals who are sick and actually need that kind of care and attention would do. So these are the 4 options. How do you think these options reflect the deaf? Well, if you answered, shows that they have low potential, that they didn't know what to do with them, so they sent them off. They weren't really treated with a high regard. Yes, exactly that. So Thomas Hopkins, Gallaudet, and Alice, right? I'm gonna continue referring to Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet as just Gallaudet, right? So Gallaudet and Alice. So he realized that she was smart, and I need to say that because, again, people really assumed that they were dumb, and that's where the term deaf and dumb comes from. We don't use that term now, but that was very common, deaf and dumb. So he realized that there was a level of intelligence to her, even though he couldn't speak or hear, or she couldn't speak or hear. He noticed that Alice wouldn't play with others. And there was one time where she was playing at a distance with others. So he brought her over and taught her how to spell hat on the sand. And from that became learning to spell other different things. And there Gallaudet noticed, like, Alice is teachable. Like, she's not dumb. She's able to copy. She's able to understand. So he got this urge and this excitement and this passion, this mission, this goal to want to teach her how to communicate. And he thought there must be other people like Alice out here in Hartford, Connecticut. So he went door to door and he created a census in which he found that 84 other people lived in Connecticut and were deaf. So with this urge and just passion and just desire to teach Alice, he didn't know where to start. But he asked the community for financial support for a trip to Europe. And I question why. Remember, in Europe, you could find Braidwood Academy. So he knew about Braidwood Academy. He said, I need money, I need help, I need financial support for you all to take me to Braidwood Academy. There, they teach people like Alice, and I need to learn their methods to bring them back and to teach Alice and the 84 other individuals in Connecticut. So they took a trip to Scotland. Or he took a trip to Scotland, and unfortunately it was not successful at the Braidwood Academy. Their approach and technique to educating was held as a secret. They monopolized the education that they gained of teaching deaf individuals, and by virtue of that, it became a family secret. It was a family-run business, a family-run school, and the way they taught people was not open for the public to know. And of course, because they were monopolizing, they were able to gain a lot of financial profit. So why would we ever share information to jeopardize our wealth? So over there, he found his terms and conditions, and these were some of them. He had to stay 3 to 4 years to learn their method. And the Braidwoods must be paid for every child that Gallaudet educated. So he wasn't going to get paid. I'm sure he did get some type of compensation back, but he would pay to teach instead of being paid to teach. So Gallaudet was like, nope, miss me with that, thanks, but no thanks. And just want to put a side note here that the Braidwood Academy focused on oral education, which means teaching deaf children how to speak. They practiced and forced lip reading and auricular training, which again means like there was no focus on signing whatsoever. It was all having deaf children speak. So that's what they were known for. So then we get to a school in Paris, which was the National Institution for the Congenital Deaf Mutes in Paris. And I just want to set up the picture here. We have Abbe de la Paix, we have Abbe Sicard, Jean Massue, and Laurent Clerc. These two individuals are hearing. These two individuals are deaf. So so Gallaudet was traveling around at this point. He was traveling around in search for how to teach Alice. Like there had to be another way. So thanks to his persistence, he ended up finding himself in I would say like a hall, right? A showing of the Institute in Paris and their wonderful students. Abbe Sicard. So let me go back. This guy taught this guy who taught these two guys. Right? So he's considered the father of deaf education, or the father of the deaf. He taught him, he taught these two. So he was here in an auditorium full of people showing everybody how, wow, look at these two deaf people. And if you ask them anything and then I interpret it using some manual signs, they know it, they understand it, and they could give you a correct answer. So again, I want to root you back into the lens of people had no expectations for the deaf. So it got to the point where they actually set up an auditorium and they were traveling around literally almost on tour showing how if you sign to deaf people, they understand and then they make connections and then they're smart. Like this is how ridiculous that essentially was. So Abbe Sicard, right, was showing off the success of their teaching methodologies, which is different than that of Braidwood Academy. Because remember, Braidwood Academy was an oral approach. They had an oral approach to education. Whereas the school in France, they had a manual approach to education. They were teaching them through signs. So the signs that they used was LSF. What is LSF? I'm so happy you asked. It's, okay, I can't really say this in French because I've tried with the French teacher at school and it just doesn't work. So it's langues de signes françaises, which is a brutal way of saying language of signs of the French. Which is LSF. We would never say FSL. We would never say French Sign Language. We would say LSF in reference to the signed language that is used in France. So Abbe Sicard showing off Jean Massue and Laurent Clerc. The people in the audience would ask Abbe Sicard something. Abbe Sicard would interpret it to Jean Massue and Laurent Clerc. And because when you give somebody language, all they have to do is see the language if they grew up in it and they learned in it, then you could just literally ask anybody anything and they understand it. So they were just showing off on how, look at this. When you teach deaf people how to sign, they therefore become just like us and coherent and intelligent and they are able. So this is what that looked like. So Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet happened to trample over this and was like, this is what I need and what I want and what I've been looking for. So Abbe de la Paix, like I said, he is considered the father of the deaf. He established 21 schools around Europe, and most notably the National Institution for the Congenital Deaf Mutes. I'm using this term deaf mutes because that is exactly what that institution was called in 1771 and around that area in which he set up schools, but it is no longer called that. It is called the National Institute of Paris, I believe. I did not go there when I went to France, and I really should have, but I didn't. But this is what it looks like now. Very pretty. And this is, I'm not going to lie, I got this off Google, and I'm hoping that's what it looks like. That's what it looked like back then. But I'm just going to cite my sources and say my sources might be a little questionable. This for sure is what it looks like now, though. So students came from all over the world. Remember, there weren't a lot of options for deaf children. And they learned French Sign Language. I put that here, but just to put LSF, right? And if anyone is able to say this, please show me next time we see each other. And they learned LSF because that is a language, that's a mode of communication in which they were being taught through. But remember, they would come from different parts of the world, and then they went back home. And back home, not everybody at home had that privilege to go to school in France. So when they came back home, they taught their deaf peers, their parents, their deaf friends. So when they came back, it shows now as we look at all these signed languages that LSF is finally threaded in all these other languages, these signed languages. So LSF indeed spread through all of Europe and the world. Give me a second. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that pause. So LSF spread by virtue of students going there to France and then coming back home and then using these signs to educate others and just using this method of communication to communicate with others like them. So Gallaudet took notes when he was looking at John Massieu, at Laurent Clerc, and Abbe Sicard. He was taking notes, and he just was floored with how they were learning, how they were communicating, how were they so successful. So Gallaudet asked Laurent Clerc, actually he asked Jean Massieu first. He said, come on over. Right, these are the top 2 students of the school, and later to become teachers of the deaf themselves, teaching other deaf children. Gallaudet asked Jean Massieu, and Jean Massieu said, no, I'm good. And then he went to Laurent Clerc, and he was like, please, come to America. Come to America. We can set up a school just like this. There's people like you in America, and they need what you have. So after some negotiation, especially with Abbe Sicard, who was his teacher, and of course the institution, they had actually agreed to only be there for a few years, for 2 to 3 years, but he stood longer. But Laurent Clerc joined Gallaudet back into America. So in their voyage, Gallaudet taught Clerc English, written English, and Clerc taught Gallaudet LSF. All right, so they each, on their voyage back to America, they taught each other the languages they know. In 1817, they founded the first school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, which was named the American Asylum for the Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons. All right, now the school is called the American School for the Deaf, ASD. It is the hub, the prime hub, the holy grail of deaf education, because number 1, of its history, number 2, of its quality of education to the deaf and hard of hearing, to the pride of knowing that everybody in that school, from administrators to students to teachers, everybody in between, they all know American Sign Language, and it is just the epitome of deaf-friendly education in a deaf-friendly world. So the American Asylum for the Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons was established, and the first student, drum roll please, Alice Cogswell. So in Hartford, Connecticut, if you pass through, you can still very much see the sign that says American School for the Deaf. It is still functioning. It is beautiful. So we continue. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet died in 1851. And his son, Edward Gallaudet, takes on the baton and continues the race. He was a teacher of the deaf in 1855, starting at 16 years old at the American School for the Deaf. So he continues his father's footsteps. In 1857, though, he becomes superintendent for the Columbia Institute for the Deaf and Dumb and the Blind in Washington, D.C. So remember how, like, everyone just gets dumped in an asylum? Like, everyone just also got dumped into a school here. So in D.C., he's doing good work. He's in leadership here. And he's like, wait, hold on. Like, just like hearing people can further their education, like, deaf people need to further their education as well. So in 1864, Edward Gallaudet, again, this is the son of Thomas Gallaudet, who had gone and search for a better education in life for Alice. He proposed the creation of a deaf college. He created an act in which Congress voted and passed to create a university for the deaf and hard of hearing. That university is Gallaudet University, the one that you a few weeks ago learned about, and the school that I went to continue my education as a teacher of American Sign Language. And Abraham Lincoln signed the act. So Abe Lincoln was a friend, not a foe, in the deaf community. he was advised by some deaf people himself, so he knew about the deaf world. Now, I put this up here as a fact or a myth. I'm just going to say it's a fact because it just aligns with this awesome history. So they say that Abraham Lincoln is signing his initials, and that is just, an ode to his contribution to the deaf community. So you can see over here the letter A, and then a loose letter L. Now people say that's a myth. If it's a myth, then you know what? It seems like a real solid fact considering his track record with the just the empowerment of the deaf community. If it's a myth, let it be a myth, but if it's a fact, that's a cool fact. So I'd like for you to see this video on your own. It is an admissions video of Gallaudet University and just what Gallaudet University is. Now, as we continue, right, deaf people, they're thriving and they're building community and they are learning about each other, about their worlds. But we also have what we shared from Braidwood Academy, sorry, which is the approach of oralism. So ASL Vixen, sorry, my dog is so rude. Vixen. So ASL is the native and natural, keynote on natural, language for the deaf, right? That's what, when you're deaf, that's the language that you should be learning. You should be taught. I'm not born in Puerto Rico, and my native and natural language is Creole, right? That doesn't work like that. Just like if you live in Haiti and you're born in Haiti, your natural language is not going to be Spanish, right? In the context of where you live and who you are, that's where your natural and native language comes from. So the deaf, their natural and native language is American Sign Language. Oh my goodness. Give me 2 seconds as I try to figure out what's happening to my dog. Pardon me, my child has no manners. So, oralism, though, is also another approach to language for the deaf, and that is, again, when deaf people speak. Now, there are some deaf people that still can hear, so producing language is not as troublesome or not as hard as someone who can't hear at all. Right? So there are deaf people that can speak and they choose to speak, and that is okay. I'm a huge proponent for whatever you want to do, but hearing people should not be forcing you to do what they want you to do. Oralists obviously are in support of oralism, and oralism, using the moral method of communicating. At their extreme, oralists believe that the deaf must learn speech to successfully and fully function in a hearing society. So they're saying American Sign Language shouldn't be a thing. Like, you're in a hearing world that speaks, you should do the same. They believe that speaking is greater than signing, and that really, speaking goes first, and then signing is sub. It's the plan B. So, with that said, we get to Alexander Graham Bell, the Alexander Graham Bell. What was he known for? His invention of the telephone, among many other things. But we learned that Abraham Lincoln was a friend. Alexander Graham Bell, he was a foe. And let me tell you why. He was a wealthy oralist. He was the founder of the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf. It is now a thriving organization named the A.G. Bell Association. He was a leading oral advocate. He was a phonetics teacher. He was a skillful signer, as noted and written in many books about him. I didn't get to see him, but many people wrote about how beautifully he signed. He knew his stuff. But just like any good, strong, extreme oralist, he believed that speech was of supreme importance. And I quote, he said, "The deaf should assimilate into hearing society. Deaf people weakened the society in which they lived." This is written in his books that he wrote himself. A wealthy oralist means that they're an individual that's an oralist that has money. And what does that have to do with anything? Money equals power equals influence among many things. So I want you to hold on to that thought as I continue painting the picture of Alexander Graham Bell. Bell's mother was deaf. And his idea of deafness was shaped by his mother and his experience. His mother learned and was a success story of the oral approach to education for the deaf. So she would have probably been a success story for the Braidwood Academy, not necessarily the National Institute in Paris. But I read that she would put his mouth close to her forehead and the vibrations would help her distinguish speech more clearly. Now, if you were to put your mouth by my forehead and then speak, and if I was deaf, I don't think I'd be successful. But somehow, Miss Graham Bell was successful. So remember when he said that deaf people weakened the society in which they lived? So his goal was to eliminate the growth of the deaf population to do so, by virtue of that. And to do so, he had several solutions. The first one was eliminating residential schools. Now, let me explain this to you. After Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and then his son Edward Gallaudet, there were many schools that became schools for the deaf because people started spreading, started moving, deafness and ASN, assigned language, came to be. And I do want to give it a little side note that because of Gallaudet and because of Laurent Clerc, ASL was created. They came back, and people from Martha's Vineyard and their signed language, along with LSF and Plains Indian Sign Language, Native American Sign Language, all those three came together and it formed American Sign Language. So we have very heavy influences in those three sign languages, which is what we know as American Sign Language today. So he said, we got to get these people out of here. They are contaminating the human race. The deaf contaminated the human race in his eyes. So eliminating residential schools takes away the role models that you have, takes away the opportunities to be successful by virtue of having deaf people near you and empowering you. When you take away a role model, you take away your education. When you take away your language, you take away identity. This was his way to eradicate the deaf community. He forbidded the use of ASL. Again, remember, he's powerful. He has money. He has been acclaimed with many successes, right? He's attributed, like his contributions to society have made him a renowned individual. So when he says that we should forbid ASL, people are taking heed to that, right? Prohibiting deaf adults from teaching deaf children. Again, if I take away your role model, and if I take away your method of education and being educated, you therefore have no purpose. Your self-esteem goes low. You begin to have no other choice but to follow suit and learn how to speak. And banning deaf with deaf marriages. So if, in his eyes, if I don't allow two people that are deaf to get married to each other, it lessens the chance of deaf people creating another deaf person. And now we know that that's really not how it works, Mr. A.G. Bell, right? You can still be deaf in many other ways, and that really only works for if you have a genetic deafness. But, so he believed if we ban deaf-on-deaf marriages, it promotes the societal cleanse that he wanted and he was envisioning. So, again, A.G. Bell, the books in elementary school and middle school and high school ain't teach you about this. Nope, they ain't want to tell you all that. They kept that hush-hush. So, him, the telephone, deaf people, what is going on? I also want to share with you, I don't know why I have this flipped, but the irony, his wife, who was a former speech student, Mabel Hubbard, was also deaf. So, the invention of the telephone, let's go back. The telegraph was a device that transmitted messages, so like very, very antique texts. You had the phonautograph, which transmitted voice through wire and drew vibrations out. These are what the vibrations drawn out look like. That, he was part of that experience, aimed to help deaf students visualize sounds. So at that point, there was no other really piece of, object to show that sound made, like, had movement, that sound was physical. Later, by virtue of the invention of the phonautograph, which was inspired by the telegraph, the telephone was created, transmitting sounds that we could hear. So at first it was transmitting voice through vibrations being written out. Now we're transmitting from voice to voice. He was inspired by deaf people to create something that didn't even help them, but he was obsessed with having other deaf people be just like his mother. Basically a hearing individual, because she was so skilled in speaking and lip reading, right? So there was absolutely no need to use American Sign Language or any sign language at all for any deaf person around the world. So again, his invention of the telephone was directly inspired by his mother, who was deaf, and his wife, who was deaf. He wanted to communicate with his wife. He wanted his wife to hear him and for his wife to speak to him. So in 1880, right, this seems like it's linear, but a lot of things like plopped on top of each other. In 1880, there was a Milan Conference. This is really important that you know the name for it. The Milan Conference was held in Milan, Italy, and it congregated the International Congress for the Education of the Deaf. So all these people who were part of this organization that aimed to educating the deaf, they met in Milan, Italy in 1880. And the topic of the conversation was the following: which way do deaf children know how to learn best? Would it be oral method of communication or signed method of communication? So they spent much time deliberating. There were about 80 people or 81 people, and out of those 81 people, only one was deaf. So imagine being at a conference talking about a community of people in which you're not a part of that community, and then making a very, very important decision. This is what that conference was. And of course, the one deaf person wasn't going to win. So after much deliberation, but also everyone apparently seemed to be on the same page about this, they resolved the following: that oral method of signing should be preferred, or oral method of educating should be preferred to that of signs in the education of deaf mutes. What does that mean? That the oral method is better and should be preferred, so should be used over signing when we are teaching deaf mute children. Now, I also want to share here that Alexander Graham Bell was not at this conference because he was getting a prize called the Volta Prize. The Volta Prize is like the Nobel Peace Prize, but for technology. So he was actually getting awarded and recognition for his contributions to the world in light of technology for the telephone that he made. And even now, if you were to Google Volta Prize, and if you were to put Volta Prize, a Volta scholarship, the scholarship is up and running. And one of the requirements is for you to be a deaf person that speaks. So even now, we still see that discrimination. Imagine you being a deaf person and you being disqualified because you sign instead of you speaking. You actually use your native and natural language instead of one that is forced and hard to master and isn't native or natural to you. So he was at the at the Volta conference, he was getting a Volta Prize, But remember, he was a wealthy oralist. So wealth equals money equals power equals influence. Although he wasn't at the Milan Conference, his buddies were, one of those 80 that were there, which also helped him push the oral approach, because again, he had that influence, that power over people, to vote otherwise, to vote for oral instead of signing. So that happened in, I believe, February. I don't know if I have it. That happened in February. But we also have this guy named George Viditz. He was president of the National Association for the Deaf. So, George Viditz, he was the 7th president of the National Association for the Deaf. But the reason why this man is important is because he was part of the NAD, which was established as a response to the Milan Conference. The Milan Conference in February said ASL must be banned in schools. And then the NAD was created in response to that ban. The NAD, the National Association for the Deaf, their aim is to preserve American Sign Language, to protect the people that use sign language, to empower them. And the NAD now is a force. They've won so many cases in the Supreme Court level. They fight for the rights, for the protection of deaf people. Like, don't get caught up with the NAD. You don't want that, right? So he is famous for his speech. It's a 14-minute speech titled The Preservation of Signed Language. Now, the reason why this speech is important is because it is the first and earliest recording of someone signing. So from 1817, right, and that time in which Gallaudet went to went to Paris, and then came back. And up until 1913, there was obviously no recording of signed language. And that's important to know because other languages have a written form. American Sign Language doesn't. So there was no record of ASL being used the way that we can probably trace back other languages that had a written component to it. So, and because there were different, I forgot how it ended up being that motion pictures, essentially, which is the idea of videos, there was a grant to use and to learn about that technology. So they ended up using George Viditz, and he did a lecture on the preservation of sign language. So this is just a little bit of that.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It's in the Library of Congress. Right. I just want, it's not captioned, none of that. Right. So he's saying, but please do better and listen to what people require and think about the world, about teaching deaf. I have no idea. All these signs, clearly they're a little bit different. And the way he signs a little bit different. But this is the preservation. This is the famous speech and the first and earliest recording of anyone signing. It was George Viditz. So we then walk into the dark ages of the deaf community. The Dark Ages is exactly what it sounds like. It was a terrible time for the deaf community, and unfortunately, we still see the effects lingering today. So the immediate effects of the Milan Conference was the following. Replace sign language with spoken language, right? So instead of an assigned method of educating, we're now using an oral method of educating deaf children. And sign language was expelled. So if they caught a child signing, even the police were in on this. They knew that sign language was banned. There would be disciplinary actions that most of the time, many people have shared this anecdote, that they'd go to the principal's office and their hands were slapped, or with the ruler, or their fingers were taped together, or their hands were tied together. Like that was imagine your language stripped away like that. That is what the deaf experienced. Deaf teachers were out and hearing ones were in. What use are you when you cannot speak and you cannot hear? And we need to now teach how to speak and how to use the little hearing that you have left to understand what we're saying. There was a massive influence and a massive emphasis on lip reading because of the Milan Conference outcome, which is why deaf people today are super annoyed at lip reading because of the struggle rooted in the history of the deaf that started from the Milan Conference. So, how did you teach, or how did one teach lip reading, and how did one teach the deaf person that doesn't know how to hear, right, and cannot hear? How did you teach them how to speak? Here are some techniques that we are going to explore. So I also want to share that schooling for the deaf changed drastically. A huge flop or flip, whichever you want, in a negative light. So instead of deaf children going to math, learning spelling, going outside to recess, any version of home economics, learning a different craft, after the Milan Conference, that changed. Instead of spending hours learning math and hours learning this and hours learning that per week, the students were spending hours a day learning how to speak. So imagine that, like, where deaf children were thriving in their own language, being taught by people just like them about making connections to the world, making connections to the past, learning about their language, learning about science, learning about math, like all these things. Now it just got stripped away. New people came in, strangers forcing them to learn how to speak, and this was hours and hours and hours. Imagine how defeated you feel by minute 25, right? And then now you have hours and hours focused on this. The educational experience for the deaf was traumatizing. So over here, this is Alexander Graham Bell himself, and I got this picture from Gallaudet, I believe, Gallaudet Archives. So Gallaudet, you can see here, he's holding the throat of another child, and the child is touching his throat to feel the vibrations of his throat. So if you were to touch your throat right now, I'm touching my throat right now, and you could feel vibrations. With enough focus, you can actually feel and match your voice with and how it feels on your throat with someone else's. A lot of work. So this person over here, learning the O sound from the North Carolina School for the Deaf. We also have candles here, which I think was a very interesting technique. So the letter B and the letter P, if you didn't hear what came out of my mouth, the formation of those two letters from your mouth, or when you execute those letters, they're exactly the same or nearly the same. And when you are speaking, they end up looking the same, right? So candles were used when you lit the candle up to show the difference between B and P. So if the candle was lit and the candle was in front of me, and I went B, 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 the candle probably wouldn't flicker much. But if I went the puff of air might be able to for sure it's going to move the flame, but it might even put out the flame. So this was a visual representation of the difference between B and P. Even though they couldn't hear it, they could see it because of the flame. So that was another technique, which I think, even though I absolutely hate the idea of forcing deaf people to speak even when they don't want to, I think it was a genius idea to show that. The visual piece is incredible. You also had students at the McGowan Oral School in Chicago who used tube funnels for training, for auricular training. So residual hearing is like the hearing that you have left over. So like some people can be completely deaf, like we know, but there are many people that have some type of hearing It's just not full hearing. So whatever hearing you have left, that's what is called a residual hearing. So they would put this tube, one person would speak through and the other one would hold it in their ear in hopes that like the sound directly goes into their ear. This teacher is using a mirror and the child is copying what is being seen. This one is doing a test. So I guess he heard a little beep because his hand is up. So this one was really tough to know and to learn about. Hiding lip movements by speaking from behind the person or covering your mouth completely. So imagine lip reading, but then the lips are covered, or the lips you don't have access to. Most of the time this was done for students that had residual hearing enough to be able to maybe decipher what's happening with enough training. Right? So you would see how well they did and how much they understood and how smart they were by taking away the only visual cue they have to know what you're saying. So they would speak from behind, or they would just cover the mouth completely to see how much you understood. It could be as simple as repeat this word for me, or tell me the Pledge of Allegiance, or what's your mother's name? But if they don't have the lip reading that they practice so hard to master, if they don't have the lip reading as a visual aid, it makes that experience even worse. So again, now think about it. Imagine you're deaf. Imagine you're practicing lip reading. You have a small amount of residual hearing, and then they move their face or they hide their face, and you're left with deciphering what is being said. Imagine the frustration you now have going to school, knowing this is what school is now like. At the same time, though, Black ASL arose. It was created. Black ASL is American Sign Language, but used and created by the Black community in America. So segregated schools did not only stop with white and black, but it also continued with white deaf schools and black deaf schools. In black deaf schools, you had black deaf teachers, and they were also kind of forced into oral education. But remember, black schools did not have the greatest education in comparison to white schools. So in that same manner, white schools got the priority oral education. Black deaf schools did not. So black deaf schools actually, in turn, thrived a little bit more than the white deaf schools because they kept their sign language. Right? The deaf community, they were together, they were one. When there's a community that needs a common tongue, well, not a common language at this point, Black ASL arose. So, because of segregation, you should know this, because of segregation, black deaf schools and black deaf individuals created Black ASL. And it was different than American Sign Language used in white deaf schools. Now, it's important to note that when the schools desegregated, there was a clash in language because black deaf schools and white deaf schools signed differently. And so white deaf schools kind of took over and told the black deaf students, this is not how you sign. You don't sign correctly if you sign it this way. So Black ASL slowly diminished in public schools, but at home it was still signed. And very recent, I'd probably say about 20 to 25 years ago, there was a study called the Treasures of Black ASL. And it follows individuals from different black communities in America and how they learned Black ASL, how they experienced education as a black deaf individual, and if they still use it now. So it's an incredible piece. I show you little blurbs of it. But Black ASL came to be during segregation and the segregation of black deaf schools with white deaf schools. So William Stokoe, now we fast forward to 1960. He was doing his dissertation, which is the piece that you need to prove that you are a doctor to earn your doctorate degree. He was a professor at Gallaudet University, and his dissertation proved that American Sign Language has all the components of a spoken language, therefore proving it to be a real language. Up until this time, and you will learn this in the film that you're going to watch, deaf people still believed that English was superior, and they did so because of how strong and hard the effects of the Milan Conference was. If you didn't know English, if you didn't know how to read English or write English, you were not intelligent. And truthfully, some people still think that now. So if you did not know English, and if you did not know how to write or read English, you were lesser. So sign at this point at Gallaudet University and among the deaf community, it was more of a language system. They believed it was a language system. It wasn't a real language in their mind. It was just a way to communicate, and I wish I could explain it better, and I know that the film does. But to know English was still more supreme than to be able to communicate in ASL. ASL was like class B. So he's seeing these people communicate, and he's like, there's no way that American Sign Language is not a real language. So there are 5 components to make a real language, and he proves that American Sign Language has those 5 points. You don't need to speak a language for it to, like, literally speak a language for it to be a real language, all right? So he proved it, which is why... thanks to William Stokey, ASL is recognized as an official language of the deaf, but only in 45 out of 50 states in America. How crazy is that? ASL is allowed to be used now to teach deaf children again because of that finding. And of course, because of over time, people actually used their brain cells and put them together to make sense that, hey, we shouldn't be like forcing deaf people to speak. And ASL is allowed to be taught in secondary schools and colleges and universities because it's a real language. Vixen, stop it. Sorry. So, thank you to William Stokey. I have a job, and I have the blessing of meeting and teaching you all because he proved that ASL was a real language. Now, in the film, you'll see that ASL, when he proved and he was showing that it was a real language, he got pushback from the deaf community. Again, because it challenged their idea of what intelligence was. English, knowing English, reading English, and even speaking English, that was congruent, and that was evidence of intelligence. So now he comes in and says, wait, you have mastered American Sign Language. This is also congruent and evidence of intelligence. You use it to decipher meaning. You use it to express and deliver meaning. To relay information. And so you use it to understand and make connections with the world. This is what language does. Just because you can't speak ASL doesn't mean that ASL is not a real language. So this is what Stokey was fighting, and he got a lot of pushback from a lot of the community at Gallaudet University, which is what you'll learn in the video that you watch. So in July 19th of 2010, the International Congress on the Education of the Deaf, which was the same group, obviously different people, that met in Milan, Italy in 1880, they sat back down and they were like, hey, y'all remember that conference that our peoples had in 1880 banning American Sign Language? Yeah, we might need to denounce what was said. So, not that it does much of a difference, but the acknowledgement is something to be, I guess, acknowledged for. Oh man, I clicked the link and it went. So please click this link, and you will see that hold on, let me see if I could. No, I can't change it. It is a letter of rejection of the decision that was made in 1880. They write a letter saying, hey, these people were not educated and informed when making this decision, and we acknowledge that it caused a terrible, terrible time for the deaf community, and our bad, basically. So they discouraged the use of only oral education and promoted essentially choice, but also saying sign language is pretty essential to their success. And as a teacher of the deaf, in which I've had students who prefer oral methods of education versus signed, and I've also met parents who they said, not until my child becomes mute, I don't want them signing. Right? I've had those, and I've had some that say, can I hire you privately so you can teach all of us some signs so we could all communicate with our child. I've had a spectrum of people and their idea of education and how their child should be educated. And I've had to work with students, okay, we're going to work on your hearing. Or other students, we're going to work on your signing. The biggest piece that as a hearing-abled individual we should leave with is whatever their choice is, that's what we should honor and follow. Hearing people should never be at the forefront of making decisions about deaf people without deaf people making those decisions with them. And dare I say, they don't even need hearing people with them. Deaf people should be making decisions about deaf people. All right. The way that we understand the world as a hearing-abled individual is strikingly different than how the deaf experience the world in their deafness in a hearing world. So it's important that with this history, we understand and we begin to understand why deaf people don't want to be forced to lip read, why deaf people sometimes don't want hearing people in their spaces, why we have to respect when it's only deaf, or a deaf person is finagling with this idea or considering this idea, because the root of this community's history is cruel. This wasn't too long ago where if you find a great-grandparent or even a grandparent that's deaf, they probably went through the oral education of America for the deaf. It wasn't too far ago where deaf people were getting hit on their hands, were getting their hands tied, and were getting their hands hit. Like this is their reality. So when hearing people say you should just lip read, it entirely triggers a community when all we should probably do is just learn how to sign. So I want you to watch this video. It's a 2-minute video. No, not a 2-minute video. I think this is a 7-minute video. Yeah. This video, please watch this video. This is the Treasure of Black American Sign Language, the book that I showed you about, the recent studies about it. Please watch this one, The History of Black Deaf Schools. And again, this is just a highlight of how Black ASL was created in segregation. And tonight, you have 2 videos to watch. I didn't think it was necessary to put them on this video to watch with me on the audio. So view Deaf President Now and Signing Black in America and complete the lecture discussion prompt in Module 9. I'm opening up, and this is what's going to be due by tomorrow night. It is just a quick blurb. I want you to give a blurb of summary and reaction to these 2 videos. I am going to warn you that this one, the quality is just like this, but it is something that marks the deaf community. Everyone knows about Deaf President Now, DPN. Happened in 1988, so not too far long before, right? So I want us to think about what that is, how that shaped the deaf community, and also Signing Black in America, which is half-hour long. So please make sure you take time to watch these 2 videos. These 2 videos and the prompt that goes with it, which is a summary and reaction, just a paragraph for each video will do. That's due tomorrow night. And then before we see each other the next time, which is before the 18th, please be prepared with the following. You need to have viewed film number 1, which is on Module 9, write your reaction paper and have submitted it, and also be ready for a quiz on deaf history the next time we meet. So I will not quiz you on the vocabulary from last week, but I will be quizzing you on the contents of deaf history. I'm not going to sign out the questions. I'm going to verbalize the questions, and you will be able to write them down. Please make sure that you have what you need to be able to study. If you have to rewatch this, you totally can. So to be ready for the quiz on deaf history the next time we meet. And that is it for tonight, folks.